Greetings. In this video, we'll tackle three things. We'll apply textures to our paint effect tree. In the previous lessons, we just did a black silhouette on a white background. So we'll tackle applying textures. We'll also take a look at some very basic dynamics. We'll have the leaves fall from the tree. And then finally, we'll talk about setting up a render and show you how you can upload our very basic quick animation as an animated GIF. And then that animated GIF is what you'll post to the assignments page. Okay, let's review. Created a third tree, right? So you've created two trees. I'd ask you right now to create a third. See if you can do it without referring to your notes or see how far you can get. Mastery is when we're able to produce something without looking at the instructions. So give that a shot. And in this case, let's review a few things. I have my strokes selected. On our main creation, we have segments 20. This particular tree, the length is 12, the width is 1. I have my elevation max at 1 and 1. Since we're not making any duplicates or instances of this, I've just got both of these cranked up. I didn't do any twigs just because we're going to be more concerned with texturing and then a very basic dynamics project. So I've skipped twigs on this one. And then just very basic leaves. And the one thing I wanted to distinguish here, last time we made the effort to create a leaf shape here. If you look closely, you'll see that this is just a rectangle. The width, base and tip are both just the same. And that's because we're going to use a leaf picture with an alpha channel background. So that's the reason that we're not dialing in a leaf profile. And that's about it, right? We've got just a little bit of wiggle, 0.025, a little bit of, oh, don't even have any curl. We could give it maybe just a hair of curl, 0.022, a little bit of bend, 0.5, just to get some bend to those branches. So build a tree, something like this. Pretty simple, rectangle leaves, and we haven't even changed things to black because we're going to add textures. Now, if you made any changes, you certainly want to increment and save, but we're going to convert this to a poly, modify, convert, paint effects to polys. You want to make sure that you've got quad output, and we'll hit that. Now it's hidden the original stroke, right? You could also have that on a layer. I'll go ahead and put that on a layer, and you could hide that away. Actually, let's display show selection. So we've got that selected, and we'll just hide it this way in case we want to bring it back. So I've got my stroke and my default paint on layer 1. It's hidden away. And here is the converted poly. In the last movie, we talked about how you could come in here and insert some edge loops, use your soft select if you wanted to do any more kind of modeling or sculpting on that tree. But this is fine here. And then we have our leaves. So let's assign some shaders. I'm going to right-click on the tree itself. Oops, excuse me. Right-click on the tree itself and pull down to Assign New Material. Assign new material, and we'll just choose a Lambert. Later on, when we're creating really advanced vegetation, we'll talk a lot about setting up some shaders to give you the real bump map. Maybe part of your bark is more reflective than other part of the bark, which is flat. We'll talk about grayscale mapping, but for now, we'll just create a simple Lambert. Now, it's the Lambert up until this point in the semester is always the furthest right in your attribute editor, but it's kind of in the middle of some attribute tabs here, Lambert 6. I'm going to click off and just show you how you can get there very quickly. We can right-click on the tree, and rather than saying Assign New Material, right above that is Material Attributes. So we're right-clicking. It already has a Lambert assigned to it. So we'll say Material Attributes, and this dumps you right into the attribute editor where you want to be. We're going to come to the color channel, and right, if we change this color, we'd see it update here. But we're not using the color. We're going to map something, a channel, a file in this case. And we'll click that there, right, the channel, the checker map icon. And then we have a whole series of textures that we could apply. We're going to choose File, File. Now sometimes, and this is a little bit quirky, sometimes it'll dump you into the 2D texture placement for that. So make sure you've got File. And even if I clicked off and wanted to come back, again, I can select it, pull down to Material Attributes. I see this here, and this time we see that there's an input. The triangle on the left side of a square means that we have an input coming in. I can click on that, and this time it did drop us right into the file, which is where we wanted to be. Just be aware, sometimes it puts you here, and you just have to manually click back on File. We'll come to Image Name, and just on my desktop, and you can download these from Canvas, I've got my tree bark, and we'll hit Open. And you see that that is now on the tree. Let's repeat it though. I'm going to come back to color, right? So again, we can click off, we can click it. It just so happens to load us in here. If it didn't, right click, pull down to Material Attributes. We'll come to the file, and actually in this case, I'm looking for the 2D texture placement. So now we'll click here. And on the repeat, the U and the V, you can think of it like horizontal and vertical. It's really just the two space directions in a 2D map. We'll increase this by 4. And so that's repeating around, so it's a little bit less stretched. And that looks pretty good. We'll come and do the same thing for the leaves. So I want to right-click on a leaf, pull down to Assign New Material, and just for simplicity's sake, we're going to use a Lambert, just to keep things simple. In the color channel for the Lambert, and again, if you were to click off accidentally, how do I get back? Well, click on the leaf, right-click on the leaf, pull down to Material Attribute, and it puts you right in your shader. In this case, Lambert 7. I'll come and click on the map. Right, we have all of these maps. We're going to click on the file. Now, in this case, it did. As I was mentioning a moment ago, it dumped me into the 2D texture placement icon. Just click back over to File. We'll come to Image Name. And this time we're choosing the Leaf PSD, which has an alpha channel. And so you can see the alpha is made invisible, and we just see the leaf. Now, the back side of the poly is going to render the leaf fine. In fact, if I just render this, you'll see that we're seeing the leaf, even though in our display it's showing black, which just indicates which is the forward. But our polymap is being projected straight through, so we'll see it in the render on both sides. And so there you have it. That is how we can texture. Pause here, give that a shot, and we'll come back after you've got your textures assigned, and we'll create a dynamic leaf fall. See you in a minute. Okay, so you've got your textures on your tree. Let's create a dynamic simulation of the leaves falling. So first thing we'll do is come to FX, and if you take a look up here, you'll see in particles, in cloth, in hair. We're going to be looking at in cloth. The in cloth name is a bit of a misnomer. If you're thinking of cloth, it certainly does that, but we can use it as an efficient dynamic system for lots of things beyond just cloth. In fact, we'll make our leaves into an in-cloth dynamic system. And that'll give us, of all the dynamics that we have here, this will give us just a straightforward dynamic simulation. So we'll select our leaves, and we'll come to in cloth, and we'll say create in cloth. So I'm in the FX mode. I have my leaves selected. I'm in cloth, create in cloth, and I'll click on that. And a couple of things. Let's come down to the Running Man preferences. And when we're previewing dynamic simulations, you want to have, it's best to have play every frame, because each of the simulations is predicated on the frame before. So if we have it here, your graphics card is going to try and play, but it'll probably skip frames just to maintain that accurate frame rate. So play every frame, we're not going to get the true sense of timing, but it allows the computer to calculate properly. So let me just mention that again. Lots of times we'll be switching. When we're doing dynamics, we'll be using play every frame. When we're doing just standard keyframed animation, we'll be using the 24 frames per second times 1. So since this is dynamics, we'll hit play every frame, and we'll go ahead and close that. You also want to have a sufficient number of frames. So let's say 500 here, and I'll come back to 0, right? So I've got 1, 1, 500, 500, and I'll press play, and those leaves are dynamically falling. Now, they fall forever, which is kind of funny. We'll address that in just a moment. The other thing, when you're playing a dynamic simulation, because it's predicated on the frame before, you can't just simply scrub the timeline. You see that it'll get funky there. So you always want to hit this button, come all the way back to the beginning, and then you can play the simulation again. And so we see those leaves falling. They're falling forever. Let's take a minute or a moment to look at what we have here. Here is the nucleus. That's what the in particles, the in cloth, and the in hair stands for. And it's a universe. It gives us gravity. So any other in dynamics that we add will use this nucleus. Gravity here, the gravity direction, negative y, so falling down. There's some density and wind. Now, if we weren't going to render this for shadows, which we want, we could just click Use Plane. So I'm going to just demonstrate that here. If I click Use Plane, now when the leaves fall, they'll stop on that plane. And you see that they're hitting and bouncing. Now, our initial dynamics isn't set up to make it look like a leaf. So you see they're kind of going on forever. Some are floating around. And so to make this look a little more natural, we'll have to get in and play with some of the attributes. But we're going to deselect Use Plane, and we'll create our own plane because we need a surface to receive shadows, right? And we could just very quickly, let's just get this out of the way, excuse me. We'll right-click, pull down to Assign New Material. We'll make that a Lambert. We know from the previous 2 lessons, we'll crank this up to white, the diffuse up to white, and the incandescence about in the middle. And so we'll just also do this on a white background. We'll do our perspective, and we'll crank that up. And just real quick, if we were to render that, right, we don't have shadows on the light, but we've just got a basic white background. We're keeping our backgrounds real simple. We will, in upcoming lessons, talk about environment and how we can create a robust, detailed environment. But for these lessons, we're just rendering on a white background. Okay, so if I press play, those leaves are still going to fall through this plane. I could come and just, because this plane is in the same place as the ground plane, we could click that and make that work, but I wanted to demonstrate something, which is that we can come and, in the in cloth, the very first option there is Create Passive Collider. So this means that the nucleus won't have an effect on it, but that it can interact with simulated objects in the scene. So I'll hit Create Passive Collider. So now this ground plane, the white ground plane that we've created, is part of the simulation. It's a passive part of the simulation. And you see that those leaves hit there. All right. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but how can we control the leaves? How can we, for instance, make them begin to fall at a particular moment or not all fall at the same time? Now, this is a beginning of a long journey of dynamics. Dynamics, you can see, can be set up very quickly and very straightforward, But to really have fine control, there are a series of workflow steps, but we're just going to keep it simple. Maybe think of it as taking one step forward, and we're just going to stick the leaves to the tree. We're going to pick the leaves, pick the tree, and we're going to come up to in constraint. Remember, in is for nucleus, and we'll say component to component, component to component. Now you get all of these lines, which can be kind of distracting. I'm going to click my dynamic constraint here, make sure that it's in my attribute, and there is display connections. I'm going to deselect that just because those were visually distracting and they're not really giving me any useful information. If we press play now, you'll see that the leaves begin to fall, right? But they don't fall off the tree. They are stuck on the tree. And we've got some options here. We'll leave it on spring. You see that simulation. We'll come down to glue strength. Once again, I'm in the dynamic constraint. If we clicked off and we wanted to get back here, dynamic constraint, here's where we said display those connections. We'll come down, strength, and glue strength. So with glue strength 1 on, they are stuck. If we put this at 0, now we're back to before we did any kind of constraining. So there is 0 glue. With a 1, it's totally glued. And what we'll do, if we put, let's say, a 0.5, what will happen? Well, some of them will start to fall. Actually, it looks like I need to go below that. So let's do 0.2. Yep, and so there we see some are falling and some aren't. So you could even animate that. We're not going to animate this now, but if we wanted to say, for instance, have some of the leaves start and have it be even more progressive, we could animate the glue strength going from high to low. We won't do that this week. This looks okay, right? We don't have all of our leaves falling. Looks like some of them got blown off. But when they hit the ground, they kind of are flying all around. So we'll come back to our in cloth. This represents the leaves themselves. And we can come to collisions. And then down here, right, we wouldn't want these to bounce. You could turn up bounce and then the leaves would of course bounce. We'll turn up a little bit of stickiness and a little bit more friction. And I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, so let me, yeah, there we go. A little bit better. Let's just really pull these up and see what happens. Now some of them, yeah, I think that's the friction. Let me pull that down and see. Yeah, that's what we want. So we don't need friction. We just want stickiness so that when they hit, they kind of stay stuck on the ground. And that's very nice. Let's just review that. We came in, we have our poly, we picked our leaf. In the FX mode, we came up and we created an in cloth. We could just press play at that point and the leaves fall, but they fall forever. So we created a plane, and with that plane selected, we said create passive collider. Now the leaves fell and hit the ground plane and didn't fall through it, but all the leaves began to fall at once. So one way to handle that, we selected both the leaves and the tree, and we went to in constraint, component to component. So it's sticking the components to the components. That gave us this node here. We learned that we can turn the display connections on and off. We came down, and the only thing we changed on here was the glue strength. We put it at about 0.2, so not all the leaves fell, and they fell a little bit more sequentially. Then we didn't like the way that the leaves kind of floated around too much as they hit the ground. So we came to the in cloth itself, which represents the leaves. And I mistakenly was thinking friction here, but actually what we wanted was just stickiness. So we put that to 0.5, and so they stick a little bit better to the ground. They don't blow around so much. All right, so give that a shot. And let's see about how many frames. We'll say that is done at about 150. Okay, so let's talk about rendering. If we render now, we'll see that we don't have any shadow. So we'll create a light. As we did for the previous, we'll just create a directional light. We'll hit the T key, right? And then we can position this. You want to make sure that lights is on and that shadows are on, right? If you're not seeing that, turn on your lights and turn on your shadows. And we're going to pull this up and give ourselves that standard 45-degree up and over for our main light. Now, if we render now, we don't see the shadow. We learned in the last lesson that our light is ray traced. We don't have ray tracing on in the render settings, and so we're not seeing this shadow. In our last couple of lessons, we turned on depth map shadows, and when we rendered, now we'll see the shadow in the render. But let me demonstrate why we need to use rendered shadow, ray tracing shadows in this particular project. So let's let these leaves fall. And you can see it here. The shadow is looking at that rectangle. The shadow is not appreciating the alpha of that Photoshop file. So if we render this, right, we see the alpha on the mesh itself, on the leaf itself, but the shadow isn't calculating. So this is the first example of an advantage of ray trace shadows over depth map shadows. Ray trace can cast the shadow through transparency. One of the main drawbacks of the depth map shadow, the advantage is that they're very quick. The disadvantage is that one of the disadvantages is that it doesn't draw through a transparent alpha. So we will have to ray trace this scene. We'll come up to, let's turn that off. Let's turn our ray trace shadows back on. And in future lessons, we'll come back and talk about the angle and shadow ray, but just for now, for simplicity's sake, we'll leave that alone. We'll come to render settings, and we'll come out here, and we'll just come down to ray tracing. Go ahead and leave it at the low quality. We'll come to ray tracing. Doesn't update in our scene at all. In fact, I'm going to click this one just so we can compare. I'm going to save that one. And now let's re-render with our ray trace. And I'll save that one. And we should be able to zoom in here. Right, so there it is, no ray tracing depth map shadows. The shadow isn't calculating through that transparent alpha. But when we turn ray tracing on, it does. Now this is a very low quality and I've zoomed it in, but we can see rectangle, the actual leaf shape, cast shadow. So we created our directional light. We have the default use ray trace shadows on for the light. Let me click off and click back on just to make sure you know where we are. Directional light. We've skipped depth map shadows and we're using ray trace shadows. We've come up to render settings. In the software tab, right, we're my software, we're on the software tab. We came down to ray tracing and turned that on. Now let's, so that gave us a individual render and it looks okay. So let's see, um, just depending on the time, I'm going to put that to production quality and I'm going to leave it at 960 by 540. And that's not too terribly long. So that's not too long. Yeah, so we'll actually let's do this at the 1K square. I'll zoom in. Yes, let's render this project at the 1K square, and we'll just kind of compose it so that we get all that shadow. And this will make a good little animated square GIF. We'll come back to the render settings, and let me just render this one. Okay, so there it is. And that took 19 seconds. And we're going to render out about 150 frames so you can calculate, so that's 3 a minute, how long that will take. Let's set up our render settings. So we're on the Common tab. Now we want to name it here. This will be what render. So we'll call this, right? So Crier Tree Dynamics, we'll use JPEG. So render JPEGs. This is important in terms of the numbering. We want name.number.extension. So name.number.extension. Be very careful here because there are some similar looking ones. Name underscore number.extension, right? So it's name.number.extension. You can leave the frame padding at 4. And we're going to do 150 frames, I think. We've got our 1K square. If your computer's taking much longer than about 20, you could reduce this size a little bit. But we're going to see how nice the rendered GIF looks. So we'll see if we can't get it to work at the 1K square. So just to review, I'm in the Common tab. I've named it. I've selected JPEG. Really important, name.number.extension. We're going 1 to 150. This is our perspective view, right? Later on when we create cameras, you'll need to make sure that you're selecting the camera you want to render. I've got a 1K square. I've got my production quality. And actually to help improve, let's just go 1, 6, and 2. So we'll pull these down to the preview level, 1, 6, and 2. And that should increase our render time. So if we look here at the path, users, you'll see your name or your computer there. Documents, Maya, projects, default, images. This is where these 150 images are going to render. And that's where you will need to go and select them and upload them to the GIF animation application online tool that we'll be using. So there's our path. Name, JPEG, name.number.extension. 1 to 150. We're rendering the perspective in a 1K square. We've got production quality on. We've got ray tracing on. 1, 6, 2. So we don't come here to render multiple frames. That just would render an individual frame. So we have to come to the rendering mode, rendering, and we'll come to render, batch render. Now, as we mentioned a moment ago, this is going to take some time. So you'll want to batch render, have all your other applications off so that Maya can have all of the RAM for your machine, and then you'll go get a cup of coffee or have lunch and come back and the render will be complete. But we'll hit batch render, and let me just get you started. Down here in the command line, on the status line, it says result rendering with Maya software. And we want to wait till it gets past the first frame. Usually if there's a problem or if there's any kind of problem, it won't get past that first frame. And so here you can see it going, rendering frame 4, and it's giving you a % for each frame. So that took a moment to get going. I paused. That took about 45 seconds for Maya to get ready to begin rendering. So, right, as long as you're to this point where you see rendering done and you see the percentage of each frame, you know you're in business. And as I mentioned, you can go and do something else. You don't want to do anything else processor intensive on your computer. In fact, I hear my fan heating up here. So you could probably browse the internet, but don't watch Netflix at the same time Maya is rendering. You'll slow down or likely crash. Now, if your renderer didn't get going, what we'll have to do is come back and bring down the quality or bring down the size. So bringing to intermediate, maybe you're doing a 600 by 600 rather than a 1K, and you have to bring down the size, bring down the quality. But 1K with this simple scene, even an average computer ought to be able to render this. Okay, we'll pick up when this finishes in a few minutes. Okay, we can see down here, render completed, and we'll open Fcheck, which comes with Maya. So if you come to your applications folder, Autodesk, here is Maya, and here is Fcheck. We'll double click Fcheck. We'll say File, Open Sequence, and we can see the list of images. And we just pick the first one. We want to make sure we can see it all. So I went Cryer Tree Dynamics 001. You see the list of all the rendered images. And Fcheck doesn't play to speed. It's just going to play as fast as RAM. So it's not a true playback, but it lets us know that it rendered, it was the proper camera, everything is sequenced properly. And so we get a confirmation with Fcheck that all the frames worked. So if you come to easygif.com, and if you have a Gif Maker right on your computer, you can use that one. I'm just assuming that you don't have any video editing applications on your computer. This is a really nice little free Gif Maker. And so if you don't have video editing application or you don't feel comfortable, you can just follow these steps with me. So we'll come and we'll say Gif Maker. And we'll first come to choose files, right? So once again, I'm at easygif.com and we've clicked on Maker, so /Maker, and we'll say choose file. And we came right, Cryer, documents, well, your name, your computer, documents, Maya projects, default images. And we need to shift select all of our images. So we did 150. So I picked one, and I'll come down to 150, and we'll say choose. And then once we've chosen those 150 files, you see that there, we'll hit upload and make a GIF. Okay, so they have loaded now. That took about 90 seconds on my side. And we want to come all the way down. You see that you've got all 150. And they're set to a delay of 2. We want it to play 1 frame per second, but if you put in 1, sometimes that creates a skip, actually. So I figured delay time of 2, and I think it says so in the help. So we'll say delay time of 2, and that automatically loads all those up at 2. So you can see, right, they all say display for 2, and they'll give us close to real time. Now we'll hit make GIF, and we'll have to wait a moment again. The little cat is dancing here. So here is our animated GIF. It's showing that. And what we want to do is come to optimize. So this is 12 megs. That's very, very large for an animated GIF. We could have just made a movie file at that size. So we'll come to optimize. And let's go to 100. Because our visual is still good there. We'll hit, we'll say 110, and let's try that again. Okay, so we've got 7 megs. Remember that usually when you're looking at animated GIFs on the internet, they're very small. We rendered at 1,000 square just because we want to see this as a movie. And we'll be using animated GIFs for short sequences until we decide how we'll tackle rendering for video editing, creating an MPEG 4. But we've got this here, and now we can download it. Excuse me, save. Yeah, so we'll hit save. And that just dropped it in my download folder. And on the Mac, we, in order to see, we want to come to Quick Look. So we can say Quick Look. You could just drag and drop this into your browser. And there we have it. And so this is what you'll upload to the assignments page. We'll have a bulletin board and you can upload your individual GIFs.